A+ലേക്കുള്ള വഴി ഇനി തനിയെ തുറക്കാം. Subscribe to the ENCLAPS channel. Ring the bell button and open success. It's that easy.
I love reading stories. They stir my imagination and open up new worlds for me.
That's cool, Chimbu. That's what stories are meant for. They give us a temporary refuge, a place full of hope and an assurance that dreams do come true. They help us discover the world around us and, of course, the people around us. But some stories alter our thoughts about something or someone. They create stereotypes. They may not be untrue, but the problem is that they may be incomplete. They may give us wrong perceptions. Can there be such stories? Of course, but not in books, in people's minds, in their thoughts and assumptions. The single story which they feel is the only story. Well, let's listen to what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has to say about this in her speech, The Danger of a Single Story.
I am a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So, I was an early reader. What I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read. I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading.
Yes, that's how she begins her speech. She was a girl born and brought up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. She says she started reading at the age of 4 and she mostly read British and American children's book. She adds on and says that she was an early writer too. That's awesome. She started writing at an early age of 7. Her stories were written in pencil with crayon illustrations. That's how children's books look like. And her mother's duty was to read her stories. Chimamanda wrote exactly the kind of stories that she read. All her characters were white-skinned and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples and talked a lot about the weather, like having a bright sunny day once in a while. She wrote so because that's what she saw in the books that she read. But her land, Nigeria, did not have blue-eyed, white-skinned people as natives. They never had snowfall. Every day was bright and sunny in Africa. Africa was a land of mangoes, not apples. Now, this is a clear example of how vulnerable we are in front of stories as children. Children love stories and they imbibe them in their heart.
What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamarale, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized.
That's true. Chimamanda Adichie read only British and American books, and so she thought books can have only foreign characters in them. But then as she grew up, she started reading African books. It was not easy for her to find African books, and soon she found the books of African writers in English, Chinua Achebe and Kamara Lai. Then she started to write about things with which she could personally identify. Her characters had skin the color of chocolate. They had kinky hairs which could not form ponytails. She loved the British and American books because they stirred her imagination and opened up new worlds for her. But the African books saved her from the danger of a single story. The single story about what books are. Now, was that her only experience about single stories? No, she has more to say.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So, the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know? People like Fide's family have nothing." So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit, and his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them.
So that's her next experience. But who is Fide? Well, she belonged to a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. Her father was a professor and mother was an administrator. They had a boy from the nearby village as a domestic help. His name was Fide. All that she knew about Fide was that his family was very poor. Her mother sent yams and old clothes to his family. Very often, her mother reminded her about their poverty when she didn't finish the food. So, she felt enormous pity for Fide's family. But then, one Saturday, the whole family visited Fide's house in the village and their perception changed. Fide's mother showed them a beautifully patterned basket of dried raffia made by Fide's brother. Chimamanda was startled because she never thought that anyone in Fide's family could actually do anything like that. All she had heard about them was that they were poor, and it was almost impossible for her to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was her single story which she had formed in her mind about them. Now, that's not the end. She has more personal experiences to share, but we will see that in the next class. Bye.
3 ലക്ഷത്തിലേറെ വരുന്ന ചോദ്യോത്തരങ്ങൾ ഏറ്റവും കുറഞ്ഞ ചിലവിൽ സ്വന്തമാക്കുവാൻ ഉടൻ തന്നെ ഡൗൺലോഡ് ചെയ്യൂ ENCLAPS The Learning App.